A new head coach, a second-year quarterback. Can the Chicago Bears get their rebuild off to a good start in year one under Matt Eberflus? Tune in to find out. What is going on, everyone? It is Connor, the co-host with the most, back with another 2022 NFL team preview, this time looking at the Chicago Bears. Now, we are about a third of the way through the NFL team previews, so if we've already done your team and you missed it, then make sure you go back and check it out. Make sure you check out all of our other team previews as well. If we haven't gotten to your team, then we promise we'll get there eventually. Like I said, we're about a third of the way through, coming up on halfway, so we're getting there, but yeah, let's get right into it with the Chicago Bears. Now, the Chicago Bears are definitely going to be on the lower end of teams this year. I know it's not really going to make Chicago fans happy, but, this is a rebuilding team, and let's get right into the first thing this year, which is going to be the Matt Eberflus and Justin Fields combo here. Now, the Bears obviously fired Matt Nagy in the offseason. Terrible head coach. I'm sure a lot of Bears fans would agree with me that him getting fired was about one season too late. But the curious thing to me about when they went out finding a head coach was they brought in Matt Eberflus. Now, I'm a defense guy. I like having defensive-minded head coaches, but I'm not sure he's really the right head coach to pair with Justin Fields. You've got a young quarterback who's in his second year. He showed flashes of brilliance in year one, but, he spent most of the time running for his life, and, the Bears obviously didn't win as many games last year as they really had hoped for. So, definitely an interesting decision there to go with a defensive-minded head coach when you have a second-year quarterback. It wouldn't have been my choice. That's all I have to say. Like I said, for maybe another team, I would have picked Matt Eberflus to be my head coach, but it's definitely would not be my choice for this season. Now, I know they do have offensive coordinator Luke Getzy. Now, he is going to try and create a new offense for this team, which is probably good, considering that last year, the offense was a bit uninspiring. And like you said, you have a young quarterback. You want to start to build around Justin Fields and build around him and make this team his. So, definitely want to get a new offense in place, one that suits him more. He's a dual threat quarterback. He can run, he can throw, he can do it all. Now, I was never really big on Justin Fields coming out of college. I know Ohio State is known for producing some duds at quarterback, but Justin Fields he looks like he's got potential. I definitely could see him doing well. It's just that, he really needs to continue his development in year two. I know the biggest problem for the Chicago Bears right now is going to be the offensive line. They objectively have one of the worst offensive lines in football. They drafted Tevin Jenkins last year, and he really wasn't that good in year one. They do have another second-year tackle in Larry Borom on the team, and like I said, both of them were not very good last year. Like, Borom was better than Jenkins was, but they really need to step up and continue the development, especially Jenkins. You spend a first-round pick on an offensive lineman, you're going to want them to be a really good offensive lineman. So he definitely needs to continue his development. And the other three are just, there's some veterans thrown in there, like Cody Whitehair is a veteran, but it's just, they're one of the worst offensive lines in football. So it's not really going to be doing Justin Fields any favors. He's probably going to be running for his life, especially if they can't get the run game going. David Montgomery is a good running back, but any good running back needs an offensive line. If you don't have an offensive line, you can't do anything in this league. And unfortunately, the Bears are going to be hampered by that a lot. So, like I said, they are in a rebuilding phase, so it's not a huge concern right now because it's not like they're going to be trying to go for a playoff spot or anything, but it's definitely something to look for in the future. So I'm going to move on to a lot of the pieces that they lost in the offseason. So obviously, they lost Khalil Mack. They traded him to the Los Angeles Chargers, and they lost Akeem Hicks as well to free agency. So definitely losing two of their biggest and brightest stars on defense is a big problem. They do still have some good pieces on defense, like Roquan Smith. He's about to become a free agent next year, so they're definitely going to want to work on locking him up. They still have Robert Quinn and Eddie Jackson as well. But the rest of the defense is just really uninspiring. There's not really anyone on that defense. Like, most people, I would assume that if you looked at the Bears defense, outside of those three guys that I named, if you looked at their defense and you weren't a Bears fan or like a sports, enthusiast, you probably would have no idea who most of the people are on their defense. It's who knows, maybe they can become the next no-name defense like the 70s Dolphins defense, but I'm not holding out any hope for that. So those are definitely two big losses, but I definitely think they were good moves for the Bears in my mind. Like, it's bad from the sense that your defense is going to be worse, but, the Bears are rebuilding, so definitely offloading some big contracts, offloading Khalil Mack's contract and letting Akeem Hicks go, because he was probably going to command more money than they wanted to spend on him. I can't remember where he ended up, but, it's definitely a good thing for them to avoid paying veteran players big contracts when you're trying to rebuild. So the other lost piece was obviously Allen Robinson on the offensive side of the ball. Really had a terrible year last year. I know Zach and Eric and I, we were in a podcast fantasy football league, and we drafted him to be our number 2 receiver behind Justin Jefferson because he had a really good 2020, and boy, did he have an off season. He was really bad. So definitely probably a necessary loss for him because, again, he went into the Rams, and the Rams signed him to a contract, so probably another necessary loss for the Bears, although obviously it doesn't make their receiver situation any good when their number 1 receiver is now Darnell Mooney, which he's a good young player, but he's, in my opinion, he's not quite number 1 wide receiver material quite yet. So definitely going to be feeling the impact of losing them, but in my mind, they were all necessary moves to, okay, let's let the aging veterans go, not pay any unnecessary money for them. Let's focus on rebuilding. Maybe we can get some good pieces in the draft next year, blah-de-blah-de-blah, which brings me to where to take this rebuild. Really, the Bears, to me, it's all about offensive line, and maybe some defense. Because, like I said, with this current situation they have with the offensive line, it's not going to go good for the Bears if they keep the offensive line in the situation where it's at. Tevin Jenkins, like I said, and Orbram, they can develop in this year or two, and who knows, maybe they'll turn into good tackles. But if they don't, then the Bears are going to have to basically rebuild that offensive line from the groundwork up, kind of like what the Steelers are doing right now. The Steelers had one of the best O-lines in football for a few years when they had that core, but then, DeCastro and Pouncey and Foster all retired, Villanueva got let go, and now the Steelers have a totally different offensive line, and they're trying to rebuild it, which, as we saw last year, tends to not really go too well. It's not necessarily their fault, but it's just, it's not going to end well when you have an entirely rebuilt offensive line. So that's definitely going to be the key for the Bears in the offseason in my mind, because, they have their quarterback. That's not the problem. They have their quarterback now. They need to be spending draft picks on offensive linemen, maybe pick up a big-time free agent offensive lineman. I'm not sure who's going to be available next year, but, maybe pick up a free agent offensive lineman and also use some draft picks on defense, especially lock up Roquan Smith to a long-term deal. That's the first thing. But, go out and get some defensive linemen in the draft or in free agency. Also get some corners, because I think the safety situation is okay. Like I said, Eddie Jackson's pretty good, but definitely get some cornerbacks for that defense. And, just really, it's going to take a couple of years for the Bears to really get on track. But especially if Justin Fields can continue his development, then, the Bears could be looking good here in a couple of years. Like I said, just offensive line is a huge thing, and defensive line plus corners would be where I would be going with their draft picks and free agency. Maybe also try and throw in a little dash of receiving talent there, but the Bears need a lot, so I can't just say, oh, get this and get this and get this, because, you don't have that many draft picks. And when your team needs a lot, then it's kind of hard to prioritize, but that I would prioritize the O-line and the defensive line would be my 2 priorities for the first, especially the O-line. So coming and looking at their schedule here now, the Bears came in 3rd in the NFC North last year, which means that they're going to be playing all of the third-place NFC teams, as well as the Bears. They're going to be playing against the AFC East, which is a bit rough because the AFC East, of course, has the Bills and the Dolphins, 2 teams that are going to be competing for the playoffs and going to be competing for two teams that are going to be competing for the playoffs and competing. The Bills, especially, are Super Bowl contenders, but they do have the distinction of getting to draw the NFC East as their NFC division, which the Cowboys and Eagles are going to be tough, but, who knows? The Commanders are looking really bad right now. They get the Commanders at home. That's a winnable game. They have a home game against Houston. They could surprise the Giants. Even though they're going on the road, they could win that game. It's possible they could win at the Jets, potentially get a win over Detroit, at least, one of those games. But I'm not sure if I can really pick a key game here. I guess it's really just going to be looking at, just how they are when you kind of hit the midway part of the season. Like, okay, are we doing better than expected? And can we maybe potentially go forward and try and compete for something? Or is it just going to be a lost year and let's just focus on doing everything we can to help Justin Fields? And, if we have any injured players, like, just let them sit out the year and recover. It's going to be a long year in Chicago, unfortunately, for Bears fans. So the over-under for the Chicago Bears this year is set at 6.5. Last year it was set at 7.5, and they did go under that at 6-11. And 6.5, in my opinion, is definitely being generous to the Bears. I'm going to say they go under the 6.5. I do think they're going to be finishing last in the NFC North this year. It's going to be between them and Detroit for last place. But like I said, I do think they could probably get 4 wins, maybe 5, if they can surprise a team or two. But I think 4 wins is probably what I'm looking at, like a 4-13 record for the Bears. They should be getting a top 5 draft pick. So they can definitely get their pick of, a good player, whether it be offensive lineman or defense, to go along. Or, they could trade that pick to a team that wants a quarterback and get some more draft capital to help with this rebuild. So that's going to be it, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hit the bell to get notified when all of our new videos come out, especially all of our new team previews. You don't want to miss when your team comes out. Follow us on Twitter at clutchcrewsports. And leave any comments down below. Do you agree with my take on the Bears? Do you disagree with my take on the Bears? I'd love to hear your feedback. Also, it helps the video. So, any feedback, I'd love to hear it. And until then, I will see you guys next time.